Well, good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It's been beautifully these last 2 days. Summer's not my favorite, but whenever it gets down below 80, I love it. I spent all day yesterday hanging out in a hammock reading a book, and it was a great day. But now, we're in Zechariah chapter 13 today, and this is our second to last week. Next week, we're done with Zechariah. Next week is it. We have Zechariah chapter 14, all of it next week. So I hope you guys are ready to be out of Zechariah. Are you tired of hearing about how rough Judah's in a situation? We got one more week of this after today, and then after that, I'm going to go on to the New Testament, congratulations, and in the New Testament, to the book of Colossians. So start reading up on your Colossians, start reading what's going on in there, and we'll work through that book front to back, just the way we've done with Zechariah, and it's a shorter book, so it'll be hopefully not as repetitive as we go through, and we can get this big idea as we go through. But Zechariah chapter 13 today, and we're talking about, give me a second here. Zechariah chapter 13, it talks about the people, Judah, being scattered and scared. So here's the situation, Zechariah chapter 13, verse 7. We're only looking at 3 verses out of Zechariah today, so there's a lot going on here, and it draws from a lot, but here's the situation, verse 7. Wrong one. Did I not get it in there? Well, it's somewhere in there maybe. There it is. I got the song first and then that. I don't know what happened there. So here we go. Verse 7 now, we're back on track. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. I will turn my hand against the little ones. Now this is a tough situation where the people of Judah, the God's people, are scattered and they are scared. And now I told you just briefly that this draws from a couple other passages in Zechariah as well as a couple other places in the Old Testament. So we're going to look at some of those. But the last time we saw a shepherd, do you remember what happened? Remember what happened in Zechariah chapter 11 where Zechariah puts on a play and he acts like the good shepherd. He shows them what the good shepherd is, verse 7 in chapter 11. So I became the shepherd of the flock, doomed to be slaughtered by the sheep traders. And I took 2 staffs, one I named Favor, the other I named Union, and I tended the sheep. And so that's the shepherd from a couple chapters ago, and he's reintroduced here, brought back. And then a couple weeks ago, we also looked at the pierced one. Do you guys remember this? This was the good morning, where we look at Jesus Christ, the one we have pierced, and we identify him as Jesus Christ. We identify this shepherd as Jesus Christ. And then Zechariah 13:1, I got a little comparison here for you. So Zechariah 13:7, he says, against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me. This is Jesus Christ from the beginning, but pre-creation Christ. Because if you guys remember John chapter 1, the New Testament, John draws from this, and he says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But I want to point out, the Word was with God. And that he's right there, he's right next to him, he's face to face, he's in this relationship, this intimate relationship with the Father before creation, before anything happens. And this shepherd is next to God. This shepherd is in union with the Father, in union, has this relationship with the Father. He is our shepherd, and then he is struck later on. In verse 7 here, it points out that he is pierced, he is struck, a sword strikes him. And this is something we've already seen, somebody striking somebody. Zechariah 12:10, the pierced one, they look on him whom they've pierced, and they shall mourn. But something's different here. Did you guys notice? Where in chapter 12, we pierced Christ. We are the ones guilty for piercing Christ. We're the ones who have the sword in our hand. But that's not what happens in Zechariah 13. Instead, it is God who strikes the Son. It is God who strikes the shepherd, the one who's been there with them since the beginning. And this draws from Isaiah when he prophesies about Jesus Christ's death on the cross. And this is Isaiah 53:10. It was the will of the Lord to crush him. This is God's desire. Where before, there's 2 sides of this. Where Jesus died on a cross, there's 2 sides. Where one side, we killed Jesus. But there's also the other side where God kills Jesus. God pours out his wrath on Jesus. And that's what we see today. And we're going to look at the aftermath of what happens whenever our shepherd is struck. What happens when our shepherd dies. And it's the natural thing that you would happen. If a shepherd is struck, what happens next is the sheep will be scattered. That's the natural thing. Have you guys seen the movie The Patriot? Great American movie. You guys got to watch it if you haven't. But whenever the main character, Mel Gibson's taking his sons and they're going out and trying to fight the redcoats and the lobsterbacks, and they're trying to kill these guys, he tells them, aim for the officers, which is a bit of a no-no in this time, this era of war, because if you attack the officers, then the rest of the people scatter, or the rest of the people don't know what to do. They're running around with the chicken with the head cut off. They don't know what's going on. That's what happens here. Our leader, our figure, our king is cut off, is struck, is dead, and as a result, we are scattered and scared. And so I want to look at, there's three things in the same process, this process that goes through in the next verses 7, 8, and 9. We see this process of what happens to us, the sheep. We're going to look at what happens to these people who are scattered and who are scared and who have no idea what's going on. And we're going to look at what happens. And the first one, it's that they are reduced. The sheep are reduced. There's a bigger number, and then whenever the shepherd is struck, something bad happens, and their numbers are cut down drastically. And now this is pretty blatantly a form of judgment. Because if you have a big group and then a number of them are killed, and it's God's doing, this is judgment. And this is, God spoke generally of this in verse 7, if you guys remember this. Look back, Zechariah 13:7. This is just the general. He says, strike the shepherd, but also I will turn my hand against the little ones. He says the sheep, even the young ones, will experience the wrath of God, will experience the judgment of God. And he says they are reduced. Then he gets into the specifics of how he's going to reduce them. This is the next verse. "And the whole land declares the Lord, 2/3 shall be cut off and perish, and 1/3 shall be left alive." That's a huge number. Can anybody do 2/3 of 2,000? That's over how many? 2,000 is not 3,000, so I can't figure it out that easy. But that's a ton of people who die. That's a bunch of people. 700 people or ish are the only ones left alive. This is a huge reduction, and it's God's judgment on them. It is God saying, you have done wrong, and now I'm going to punish you. This is a huge reduction, and only 1/3 of them are left alive. And you want to know why? It's because these people have rejected God over and over and over and over and over and over. And every time God says, hey, return to me, and they say, no, thank you, I don't need that. So God pours out judgment on them and reduces them by 2/3. So there's this huge number, a huge drastic drop that falls apart, that falls down, and they die. God says, you people have ignored me, and these people they've mixed with the other nations. They have started to worship Baal, started to go after these other gods. They've rejected me, so I will cut them off. I will destroy them. They will not be around anymore. Can I tell you guys about my sister, my sister's daughter, Violet, real quick? Little Violet, she's 2.5-ish, really fun, and she likes to play with Play-Doh. Now, anybody else play with Play-Doh whenever they were a kid or have kids play with Play-Doh? Thank you, guys. Now, I'm a bit of I got a little bit of self-diagnosed OCD where I like things to be in their own order. But then Violet, she has no care in the world. She's got blue Play-Doh, red Play-Doh, yellow Play-Doh, green Play-Doh, and it's all mashed up together and it's mixed up. And it drives me nuts. I cannot stand to have my Play-Dohs mixed. That's not how it should be. And so if I want to have a pure glob of blue Play-Doh, and it's been mixed in with the yellow and the reds and the greens, what do I got to do? Is I've got to cut out all that red and that green and that blue and all that other colors so that I have just a smaller amount, but it is a pure amount of blue Play-Doh that has no other colors mixed in with it. That's what God is doing here. He says, my people, you're Play-Doh. You're supposed to be blue, and you've been mixing in with reds. You've been mixing in with yellows, and I can't have that. And so he cuts out those colors that have been mixed in with the other ones, and he separates them, and it's a 2/3 reduction. This huge amount of people, and only a small, this is why all throughout Scripture you see a remnant shall remain. That's because it's not much. It's only this tiny, tiny little amount. It's only 1/3 of the people live. And he takes this imagery, he takes this form of judgment straight from another prophet, straight from Ezekiel. Now what happens in Ezekiel, he's given the same message, return to the Lord, and he will return to you. That's the same message that we've heard over and over. Ezekiel gives this, and then as a result, nobody really listens to Ezekiel. So Ezekiel does this weird symbolic act where he shaves his head and splits his hair up into 3 piles. And then here's what happens. Ezekiel 5, verse 12. a third of you, he takes a sword and he strikes one pile of hair. And he says, a third of you shall die of pestilence and be consumed with famine in your midst. The pestilence is disease and nastiness, and natural disaster causes will destroy you. And a third of you shall die by the sword all around you. And a third part I will scatter to the winds and will unsheathe the sword after them. So he's got three groups of hair. One group he sets on fire, or he causes plague to go on them. One group he strikes with a sword, and then one group lives, but they're scattered. They're sent out and they're scared. They're afraid. It's a form of judgment. It's not good for these people. A third die by famine and pestilence. A third die by the sword. And only a small third, a tiny remnant, will remain. And then John, in his Revelation, in his Apocalypse, he picks up on this idea. This is Revelation chapter 8. And what happens in Revelation chapter 8 is that God says, hey, you angels, take your 7 trumpets and blow the trumpets. And every time one of these trumpets is blown, this is what happens. And a third of the earth was burned up. A third of the grass. A third of the sea became blood. A third of the living creatures. A third of the ships were destroyed. A third of the waters became wormwood and killed people. And this idea of thirds reiterates, emphasizes the idea that thirds means judgment. And God says, when I reduce you, whenever I take away a third of you, whenever I take away 2/3 of you, it's a form of judgment because you've mixed with the other nations, because you have ignored me and rejected me, so I'm going to cut you out, I'm going to get rid of you. But there's still a little bit left. There's still 1/3 left alive. So after they are reduced, after their numbers are dropped drastically, the sheep are refined. The sheep are refined. Now, I don't think there's any metal refineries around here, are there? We're not in Pittsburgh. We're not over up northeast. But what happens in this process is what Zechariah describes in verse 9. And there's 3 steps to this. Zechariah 13, verse 9, it describes what happens. It describes this refining process. He says, I will put this third, the remaining, the ones who are still alive, the remnants, I'll put the third into the fire, refine them as one refines silver, and test them as gold is tested. So this refining process, it takes three steps. It is, first of all, the putting into the fire, and then the refining, and then the testing. And so we're going to look at each of those real quick. Putting the fire, first of all, it's exactly what it sounds like. You take the metal, right? If you're working in a metal refinery, you take this glob of metal that you're trying to get pure silver out of, and you put it into the fire, you melt it down, and it's bad. Now, fire in the Bible means judgment. We already saw judgment with them being reduced, but then refining, it also emphasizes judgment. They're being put into the fire. And here's, Isaiah puts it really simply. Here's what he says, Isaiah 66:16. For by fire the Lord will enter into judgment. The Lord judges people, pours out his wrath by fire. Fire is a representation, is a manifestation of God's judgment. And he puts them into the fire and he melts the people down. And it's not a pleasant process. But then, and the next step in the refining process is the actual refining. This is the process of removing those impurities. So the reason you put them into the fire, where it's not pleasant, you melt them down, and then you scrape away all of the things that are not pure silver. You take away all of the non-pure silver parts, take that away, get rid of it, and then you keep doing the process over and over and over again. Metal's put into the fire, brought out, separated. Put it into the fire, brought out, separated. And that's the refining process. And he uses the illustration of like silver. He says, I'm doing this like you would get pure silver, put it into the fire, bring it out. Put it in, back and forth, over and over and over again, until finally all of the impurities are gone. And then the final step is to test. He says, into the fire, refine, and then the final step is to test it like one would test gold. This is after you've put it into the fire, back and forth, done the refining process, gotten rid of all the impurities, then you test to see if it is a pure substance. You test to see if it is a true, genuine substance that you want, something that is valuable. Now, anybody watch the TV show Pawn Stars, where out in Las Vegas, they got the guys who own a pawn shop? Appreciate it, Denise. 2 people of us in here. So they own a pawn shop, and people bring in stuff, and they give them too little money for it, and then they sell it for too much. That's what a pawn shop is. But there's one episode I remember where they're trying to teach one of the other guys some more about the pawn business, one of the lower henchmen, trying to teach him a little bit more about it. And they're trying to teach him how to catch fake gold versus real gold. And so what they do is they have two bracelets. One of them is real gold, one of them is fake gold. They look pretty good to me. It looks like gold to me. But to find out if it is true gold or if it's a fake gold, and they have this little stone. I don't know what it's made out of. I don't know what kind of element it is, but they scratch it on the stone. And if it leaves this certain mark on the stone, then it's real gold. And if it leaves this other mark, then it's fake gold. And that's what happens here. The people, after they've gone through this refining process, God takes them, scratches them on a stone, and says, is this a pure substance now? Is this a pure thing now, or is it still have impurities in it? Does it still have all these other things? Is it still an alloy of these other metals? Is it still a mixture of all these other things? Does it still have these other stuff mixed in with it, or is it pure now? So God sends them into judgment by reducing them. God sends them into judgment by refining them, putting them in this fire over and over and over again. But there's a little bit of hope at the end. There's a finished product that is good, and it's that the sheep are restored. Now, have I said this before? Have you guys heard that God's people will be restored once or twice? This is a huge theme in Zechariah. These guys who are coming out of slavery, right? 70 years against the Babylonians. It's not good. They don't have much. God says, I will restore you. I will bring you back into the way you're supposed to be. I will bring you back. Whatever happens, even though it might be rough, you'll come out in the end better for it. Here's the last part, verse 9, the last part of this. They will call upon my name, and I will answer them. I will say, they are my people, and they will say, the Lord is my God. And this draws heavily off of a passage that we've already seen before. But if you guys remember what happened in chapter 11, that's the Good Shepherd passage, where Zechariah shows them a good shepherd, and then Zechariah shows them a bad shepherd. You remember what happened to the good shepherd? The people ignored him. The people rejected him. The people said, I don't want you. And so what happens is, verse 10 in chapter 11, I took my staff of favor, representing the covenant between God and man, and I broke it, annulling that covenant. And then a couple verses later, and I broke my second staff, union, that unites the people, this covenant between the people, and I broke it. Their covenant between God, their covenant between their brothers and sisters is broken, is gone. But then we get to chapter 13, and he says, call upon my name, and I will call on you. You are my people, I am your God. It is restored again. They are back into the right relationship that they are supposed to be. And it says, they will call upon my name. They're praying to God. They've experienced tough times, and they finally realize they're wrong, and they pray to God. They call upon his name, say, God, help me. I've been reduced, I've been refined. It's tough for me. God, help me. And he comes through for them. He comes through for them. And this is the promise that God gave them back in chapter 1. He said, return to me, and I will return to you. This is what happens. He says, you have gone through junk. You've been put into the fire. You've been through hell. That's what he says. But then he says at the very end, after it all, you are restored. Call on me, and I will call on you. And this reminds me of a verse that we saw already, because this last part, he says, they shall be my people, and I will be their God. That's Zechariah 8:8, and that is echoed here. They are my people. The Lord is my God. The Lord shall be my God, and I shall be their Lord. Now, anybody have any antiques at your house? Anybody got an antique gun, an old gun from the Civil War or anything like that? Ooh, okay. Now, anybody ever taken a rusty, old, nasty, old antique and then tried to restore that? Now, just imagine for a second that you're a rusty pistol from 1824, something like that, and somebody's trying to restore you. You've got rust on you. You've got mold on you. You've got nastiness on you. And what do? They take some sandpaper to you, and they take a file to you, and they take you all the way apart, and they take away the parts that can't be used, the rusted out parts, and they replace them with different parts. It's not pleasant for the gun, I can't imagine, being rubbed down with sandpaper for a couple days. It's not pleasant being put into fire and brought back out so it can be made harder. But in the end, the antique is beautiful, is pristine, and in sometimes better than the original state. That's what happens here. He takes their tough situation and puts them through a fire, puts them through a reduction, puts them through all this junk so that at the very end they can be restored. They can, again, call Jesus, call upon the Lord, and he will answer them. And they will say, the Lord is my God, and he will say, these people are my Lord. Now, I would say come up and play right now, but I'm playing, so I'll get up there in a second. But I want you guys to see this process happen. The people, they've been going through a tough time, and sometimes in 2017, we are going through a tough time. Now, I'm going to go ahead and wager a bet that your time's not as bad as the Israelites' time, because they lost a lot of the friends, lost a lot of the family. They've been slaves for a long time, and we've got it pretty good here in America. But sometimes we might feel like we're scattered and scared. We might feel like we're being reduced. We might feel like God is stripping away things in our lives, and we might feel like we're being put through this fire, and we might not see the end. We might wonder, God, why do bad things happen to me? Why are you allowing this to happen? And maybe even, why are you making this happen to me? And the reason is found in verse 9, so that we can be restored, so we can have a covenant with God again. So if you're going through a tough time, you know somebody's going through a tough time, the process is not always pleasant, but the end result is far better than the beginning, and it is worth it. Sometimes to be restored, you have to be reduced and you have to be refined.